I'm going to be talking about MOOCs, and by the end of the talk, you'll know a bit more about MOOCs and MOOC platforms and a lot more about MOOCs on the Raspberry Pi. MOOCs, massive open online courses, are a product of the internet, but the whole idea of computer-assisted instruction goes back a lot further than that. In fact, back in the summer of 1967, I was working at Imperial College using an IBM product called CourseWriter 2, which ran on the 1401 mainframe. And course authors created and edited their courses using the 1407 console. That's the picture that you should have on the screens. And students took the course using the same device. This is quite painful because it typed at, I think, about 14 characters a second. And if you wanted to delete stuff, you had to press the rub out key and it would space back and type over. And it wasn't terribly cost effective because each student needed dedicated time.
Sorry, Romilly, are you sharing?
Sorry, people are not seeing the screen.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's because I started sharing at one point. I stole it from you.
Okay. That better?
Not yet. Yeah, there we go.
Okay. So that lovely thing is the 1407 console, which typed stuff out for the students and the authors. And the other bit of a showstopper was that each student needed a dedicated 1401 mainframe because you could only attach one of those to the computer at a time. That was a while ago, and obviously it's very much easier now to create and deliver courses on much more affordable hardware. And one of the things that I've established when I've been experimenting with this stuff is that you can actually run a class of about 10 students using the Raspberry Pi 0W, not the 02, but the 0W as a host with one or two of the platforms. My interest long-term is publishing some courses on low-cost hardware. But it's worthwhile, before I get on to all of that, taking a look at the growth of MOOCs and why they've been so successful. So the top left graph shows the number of MOOCs that were available up until about 2021. And you can see pretty respectable, steady growth going on there. And there are several reasons for the growth. One big cause was the fact that in the UK and in the US, the cost of a university education and the debt you had to go into to get it has just gone up and up and up. That top right picture is a student protest back in, I think, about 2010. Situations really got steadily worse, and it's particularly bad in the States because, believe it or not, in the States, if you run into debt, you can, if you really have to, escape it by going bankrupt, unless it's student debt. There's legislation in the States that says that if it's student debt, it never gets forgiven. So an awful lot of people have been taking a look at alternatives to traditional online education. And then, of course, there was COVID. If you take a look at the graph on the bottom left, that shows the enrollment figures for a MOOC about astronomy. And they were getting a steady trickle of students enrolling every month. And then lockdown happened. And as you can see from that graph, suddenly, huge numbers of people started enrolling very quickly, largely because a lot of students could no longer attend the physical classes that they've been going to, And a lot of other people in lockdown just found they had a lot of time on their hands and were interested in doing something useful with it. But there's another reason why MOOCs are not just popular, but I think potentially elements of huge social change. If you take a look at the picture on the bottom right, that's actually a rural school in Ghana. And as you might guess, schools like that face several challenges. First, fairly obvious, there's usually not a lot of money available for equipment. And quite often they don't have computers. The second problem is not quite so obvious. They may very often have only intermittent power supplies. And so one of the things that's really attractive is the idea of having hardware which you can run off solar power, which is particularly in Africa, a great deal more reliable and a great deal less expensive. And the third problem they've got is that quite often they've got either no internet access or intermittent internet access. So the idea of being able to bring courses to them just by getting a Raspberry Pi, which is quite affordable, and a memory stick, which is easily portable, is very attractive. And there's quite a lot of work going on. There are schools that are running that right the way over Africa and in other challenging environments as well. So a lot of good reasons why people are keen to take MOOCs, and it's particularly important that they can run on inexpensive hardware. But there are some real problems and some purported problems that need to be addressed. The real problem is soluble, I think. It's a problem that a lot of students raise, which is that traditional courses give them contact with other students and contact with teachers, and that needs attention. Not all MOOCs provide that, but it's clearly very important. But the other thing which you tend to see in quite a few papers by academics who see these things as threats rather than promises, you'll very often see statistics saying, oh, the completion rate for MOOCs is so low, they're clearly not doing their job. And this actually shows some figures from quite early on in the history of MOOCs at Harvard and I can't remember what the other one was. I think it may have been MIT. And you can see from that, the first slightly alarming statistic is that of the students who registered to take a course, in those days, something like 30 to 40% never actually started it. And that's a problem, but it's not really a problem with MOOCs, it's a problem with human nature. And we've all said, oh, I really ought to do that, and then not done it. But it's not really an issue with the technology or the value of the course. A bit more worrying is the fact that the people who say they completed the course are typically quite a small percentage, often between 4 and 8%, sometimes as high as 10. 10 is good. And that's one of the figures that a lot of the detractors pick up and point at and say, well, yeah, that means they're no good. And I don't think that's true, because they're actually, first of all, the definition of completion is that not only did they finish the course material, but they took the exam at the end and they got a certificate. Now, quite a lot of these courses will allow you to take the whole course for free, but if you want a certificate, you have to pay for it. So there are quite a few students who will take all the material, get up to the final stage and say, okay, I know I've learned it, I don't need the certificate, I'm not going to go through that last stage because I've got to shell out to do so. But the other reason I think it's much more significant, which is that a lot of students who take MOOCs want to solve a particular problem. There's something that they don't know and they want to know it, and they go to the course and they learn it, and then they're done. I've done that. I know a lot of people who've done that. And that accounts for the fact, I think, that about half the students that take the course only get about halfway through. So I don't think that's a big problem. I think they're still extremely useful. And the next thing to take a look at is, if you want to take a MOOC, how's it going to be delivered? And there are really three big groups of platforms. The jargon term is learning management systems, LMSs, but they're really just platforms for delivering courses, and they fall into three main groups. The first is quite interesting. I'm a customer of theirs, but I can't use them to provide my courses because they only sign up established organizations, typically universities or commercial providers. And the organizations that run these things like Coursera, edX, FutureLearn, great materials. And I've taken a lot of courses on them. But if I want to publish a course, they're not going to look at me. And then in the middle, there are the proprietary platforms, Udemy, Teachable, Thinkific, and so forth. I have to admit, I'm not great fans of those for various reasons. I'll touch on a couple of them. I'm going to be fairly careful what I say because I don't want us or me to get sued. But some of those platforms have a reputation for not being terribly diligent in following up reports of plagiarism. Others tell their customers that anybody can create a good course, and they make quite a lot of money out of people who pay to have their courses made available, who never make many sales. And the other is that if you take a look at the things that we know make a big difference to how students learn, most of the proprietary platforms don't provide all of those features. Some provide very few of them. I'll give you one specific example. One of the things that we know helps retention is something called spaced repetition, where something which you learn gets represented to you with a frequency that depends on how well you've remembered it last time. And getting that right can have a huge effect on the ease with which people remember stuff. Lots and lots of the proprietary platforms don't support that at all. And then there are some open source platforms, generally pretty good. OpenEdX is the open source version of the edX publisher framework. Canvas is a very successful commercial platform, but it also has an open source version. Unfortunately, neither of those are really good candidates if you're looking at something which will run on a Raspberry Pi. I think Canvas needs something like 8 gigabytes for a developer. And if you imagine what memory you'd need to supply a largish course population, it's quite tricky. So I've ended up really looking at 3 platforms, all of which will run on the Pi. One of them is called Lua Script, and it's a really minimalist thing. It's an open source tool, and what it allows you to do is to write the entire course in Markdown. I say the entire course, that's not quite true. If you want to incorporate videos or other resources, then you put links to them fairly obviously. But the structure of the course is defined by a Markdown document. The quizzes are defined in Markdown, and I'll put a link to the Lua Script site in the notes, which I'll put up once the talk is over. But if you want something that's really easy to get something up and running very quickly and really easy to share, it's tremendous, because you just give somebody a link to a browser, and then there's JavaScript which compiles your course on the fly and delivers it without any complex infrastructure. So there's effectively no setup apart from hosting your file, and it will run in any browser, and it runs really well on the Pi. So that's great. And it does quite a lot of things, but it's not that easy to extend. And there are a few things that it doesn't do that I think are quite important, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Much more widely used is a platform called Moodle, which has got millions of users, some commercial, some in the education world. And Moodle's been around for ages. It's got a huge range of plugins. But most interesting to me is there's an image which you can download, which will turn a Raspberry Pi into a Moodle box. And Moodle box is a Pi which will run the Moodle software, deliver courses, and it also acts as a Wi-Fi hotspot, so that students with phones can access the course by connecting to that Pi. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you need if you're trying to provide world-class education in one of those relatively isolated schools. And then the last thing is something called Calibri. Calibri started out as an attempt to provide the Khan Academy courses in a local environment that didn't have to be connected to the internet. And Calibri started out as something called KA Lite, Khan Academy Lite. They've done a lot of work on the product since then. It's open source, it's free, and most of the Khan Academy material is available on it. And that will run on a Pi Zero. So at home, I've got a Pi Zero with a memory stick, which has got 50 odd gigabytes of Khan Academy material on it, which I can connect to with my phone. It has its downsides in that creating courses, you're constrained to use a separate piece of software in the cloud called Calibri Studio. And if you want to add new features to Calibri, you've got a lot of work to do because it's a very tightly maintained and controlled environment. But if it's got the features you need, it's an absolutely super way of delivering to an audience that doesn't have internet connectivity or a very powerful system to run on. So I talked earlier about the features that I'm really keen to try and get for the courses that I want to develop. The first is the ability to do what's called micro learning with mobile micro learning, where not only can the students pick the bit of the course they want to take, but they can access it just using a phone. And that, I think, is something for which there's a very strong preference in a lot of the people who take MOOCs. Second feature that you need is some way of overcoming the lack of contact with other students. And there's quite a lot of software that I've found that will just run in a browser and allow a group of participants to share a whiteboard and even to have Zoom-like conversations while they're doing so. So effectively, that kind of thing can give you a virtual classroom at very little cost. If you're going to allow people to pick out individual topics in a course, then there's a problem which you need to solve, which is you need to make it clear what the prerequisites of that unit are, because there's nothing more frustrating than saying, oh, I need to learn this and start learning about it, and then discovering that it relies on something else which you didn't know. And people have been trying to address that with things called learning maps. Carrie-Anne Philbin talked about them a while ago. Various other people have been looking at them. The learning map basically shows you for each of the topics in the course what other topics they need as prerequisites. And as far as I know, none of the open source platforms support learning maps out of the box. So one of the things which I'm looking at doing is ways of both adding that functionality to the MOOC, but also looking at ways of generating the learning map using machine learning, so that you have some software which will look at the course notes and work out from that what the topics are and what the topic dependencies are. There's actually a couple of organizations doing that, so I don't think it's quite as mad as it sounds. And then another key feature, which I mentioned earlier, is the idea of spaced repetition. And I'm very keen that the platform will support that. Moodle certainly does. Calibri, I think, doesn't. And certainly the JavaScript plus Markdown tool that I talked about earlier doesn't out of the box. You'd need to do some clever stuff. So that's pushing me in the direction of Moodle, but I'll need to do some more research on that. So what I'm planning on doing is publishing research. I've actually got a website set up, although it has no contact on it. When that's ready to roll, I'll be publishing what I've found and inviting other people to chip in with advice and ideas, and I'll publish the details of that in Raspberry Pi and elsewhere when that happens. But I said at the beginning you'd know a bit more about MOOCs and a lot more about MOOCs on the Pi. We've got there, I hope. Any questions about what I've covered so far? Okay, if you think of something later, then you know, ping me on Twitter or contact me inside the Raspberry Pi Facebook page. Happy to answer the questions there. Oh, someone said, why not present this presentation as a MOOC? Watch this space. Yeah, it's a good idea, and I think I will do it, and I may well use it as one of the pilot projects for the stuff which I'm evaluating.
So in all these, is there any way for the instructor to interact with the students live?
Yes, Moodle certainly got that. In fact, it's got several ways of doing that. And again, one of the things I need to do is take a look at them and how they work and how scalable they are. It's probably the biggest single important thing to fix about online education, because people really do need that. So I'm just flipping back through the chat to see if there are more questions.
Thomas just entered a question there. Is there a course for the Pi that you'd recommend right now?
Sorry, which? Oh, of course, for the Pi. It depends what you want to do. There are lots of micro-learning type things on the Pi website. There's also a very good course which was developed by the Raspberry Pi Foundation and is, I think, still free on FutureLearn about physical computing on the Pi. I took that a while back and thoroughly enjoyed it. So that would be a good choice if it's physical computing stuff you want to do.
And do you see this being a useful concept in like first world countries as well, like in the UK?
Oh, absolutely, because whatever happens with COVID, there are lots of reasons, I think, why people are going to want to, kids are going to want to be able to access this kind of education. And there's a huge population of people who are continuing learners who can't afford to pay for a university course. And MOOCs are generally a very much more affordable alternative to that. So I think there's lots of scope in the UK. And indeed, my interest on the Raspberry Pi is partly because I have some links with Ghana, and I'm interested in things that can help there. But in general, one of the things which I'm keen to do is try to produce material that's useful for us Raspberry Pi fans as well. I think there's a lot of scope for that.
Just a general question. Looking at the Raspberry Pi Foundation website, they do a load of courses for various things. Do you know whether they've considered this idea of standalone MOOC versions which could go off to?
I'm embarrassed to say I don't know if they've considered that, but one of the things on my to-do list is to talk to Carrie-Anne Philbin about that. I mean, their main emphasis has been doing two things, and the two things that they've done pretty well. One is lots of very small, simple projects which younger people can do, and they've got loads of those on the website, and they work pretty well. But their biggest concern, I think, is teaching the teachers. And they've been doing that very effectively through their classroom-based or virtual classroom-based teaching program. So there's not, I think, been as strong a drive for them to do that in terms of their objectives in the past. That might change. And certainly if we carry on living in a world in which education is disrupted by COVID, I think they may put more focus on doing that kind of stuff. Brendan's asked, does Lua Script allow a classroom of students to take the quiz at the same time? No, it's one of its weaknesses, if that's the right word to use, is that it is entirely standalone. And if you want to do any kind of synchronization, you're going to have to write some JavaScript code yourself. At the moment, Bastian, at the moment, the platform which I'm most likely to go with, I think, is Moodle. But I've still got some evaluation to do. And so I'm still really at the exploratory stage. Educational games on the Raspberry Pi. There's quite a lot of cool stuff done. Oh, second on the list is, well, there are two runners. One is Calibri, but it does seem to be quite a constraining platform. I'm still flirting with the idea of building something from scratch, but I would really like to avoid that. I don't particularly like reinventing wheels, and it looks as if Moodle has got the wheel rim and most of the spokes. And if only I can overcome my ignorance of PHP, I can probably fill in the gaps that are missing. Syncing of quizzes. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Brendan.
I mean, when you've got like a classroom of people, getting them to take the quiz all at the same time?
I'm pretty sure you can do that with Moodle if you want to. There is so much of Moodle to learn that I'm still a beginner. I've been digging around. There is indeed, Bastian, there's a WordPress plugin which has about 3 out of the 8 things that I think you really need. That's the problem, that an awful lot of these regard quizzes as kind of the pinnacle of achievement. And they seem to be ignoring most of what we've learned about how we learn over the last 20 years. That was my frustration in trying to see if I could find something better or build something better.
Carl had a question there in the chat.
Oh, Lua Script, it's running in the browser. So all that's sitting on the server is a static file. And when you open that web page, then what happens is that in your browser, JavaScript takes the markdown and turns it into the course, and then you interact with that in JavaScript locally on your browser. So each student is effectively running the course on their computer. Oh, John, yeah, the Docker image looks good.
Question: trying to hear what hardware you have in the classroom, basically.
Does
everyone have to in order to build?
Yeah, I just spun that Docker image up in the time since you kind of started taking questions, and it started up, no worries.
Oh yeah, and there are lots of good stuff on FutureLearn, lots of good stuff on Coursera. Coursera tend these days to try and push you into paying for the course, but if you look carefully, there's always the option to audit it, which allows you to watch all of the videos and answer the inline questions, but not usually to get your projects and big quizzes marked. So if you're happy learning without that feedback, there's an incredible amount of very high quality stuff.
Cool. We better stop there. Thanks very much, Romilly.
Okay, that's
really cool. Something I never heard about.
If anyone else has questions later, ask on Twitter or ping me. I'll put the notes up later, and that will include my email address.
Great.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much.